Well, thank you, Fred, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Jack, for everything, for arranging. CRJ has been a great friend to me, so it's always nice to come back and feel like kind of a nice place to come home to as far as addressing CRJ supporters and members. As Fred mentioned, my remarks were focused on UNRWA. UNRWA has been the focus of my research for over 2 decades, as far as dealing with the anomaly of the Palestinian refugee issue, and UNRWA at large as the UN agency that has basically become the gatekeeper of the refugee problem at large. And why does UNRWA exist and how does UNRWA come about has been the focus of my research. There are several reasons for UNRWA's existence, and there are a lot of factors that play into the self-preservation of this institution. So let me first start off by the fact that UNRWA has uniquely defined Arab Palestinian refugees like no other agency has ever defined them, period. A Palestinian refugee, according to UNRWA's accounts, is anybody, and I paraphrase here the definition, anybody who lived in mandatory Palestine between 1946 to 1948, and the key underscore point is, and their descendants. No other refugee population in the world has had the element of being a descendant, and the fact that one can inherit Palestinian citizenship, or Palestinian, for that matter, citizenship, quote in quotation, but really refugee status, and pass it on from generation to generation. In contrast to UNRWA, which stands for, again, the UN Workers' Relief Agency for Palestine Refugees, there's another agency known as the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. The UNHCR comes about a few months after UNRWA's coming to fruition at the end of 1949-1950. And in contrast to UNRWA, UNHCR defines refugees only one generation. So if you would take the definition of UNHCR versus UNRWA, if you would parachute that into UNRWA based on the birth rate of individuals and were born in 48, 49, or prior to that, today you would come about 30,000 altogether. 30,000 would all demand a right of return, you call it a day, and that would not be a problem. However, that has not been the case. UNRWA is also, interestingly enough, the uniqueness or the fortuitous time that UNRWA comes to the scene was prior to UNHCR, so it had the opportunity to basically develop its own working definitions. Beyond that, UNRWA is also in Article 22 by the United Nations General Assembly. Article 22 agencies have little to no oversight whatsoever about what they do and how they do it. So the question, even from the get-go, about UNRWA's accountability and transparency has also been in question all at large. To be frank and to be honest to the agency itself, I will say that for the first decade of its existence, it was grappling with trying to be neutral or trying to stay true to its mandate. The politicization of UNRWA has taken place predominantly since the 1960s. But for the first 10 years, there was a sense that UNRWA, again, and I will underscore this point again and again, UNRWA was created as a temporary organization. Temporary, obviously, it has no end, but for years it's been, temporary. And again, the temporary status of UNRWA has been rooted in the fact that they will be able to solve the Arab-Palestinian refugee problem. And once they will solve the problem, they will leave the scene. That, of course, there are a variety of reasons why they have not left the scene, but from the get-go, the fact that they were temporary and only something that will leave shortly because the problem will be resolved was the impression they gave. Historically speaking, this is also critical to note as one understands tries to break down UNRWA and the numbers with UNRWA and they played out. The scholarship differs. You're talking between 10 to 15% difference at the end of 48, 49, between 615, 620 to about 715 thousand as far as the number of Arab Palestinian refugees at large. And the scholarship, basically the 10-15% difference, if one obviously Googles these numbers, you'll see there's ongoing debate between the crux of the debate between Ephraim Karsh and Benny Morris on issues relating to the numbers of Palestinian refugees. To that end, all of those individuals have demanded, based on UNRWA trying to solidify and codify that, what is known as a right of return. The right of return of Arab Palestinian refugees to land that they perceive to be their own. This is part of what I would define as the evergreen key demand of all Palestinians, the claim of a right of return. And the right of return itself needs to be unpacked, but it is also the cornerstone of why there is no peace, to my mind, because as long as you can claim right of return, never fulfilling its full intent, then the Palestinians continue to demand this right of return. So you have a number that comes about, 630, 715 at the end of 48, 49. They all fall under the rubric of UNRWA's umbrella. The Arab world has intentionally and calculously, in a very distinct calculus, made a decision not to take in any Arab Palestinians after the war. So with the exception of Jordan in a separate category, no Arab country has ever afforded the Arab Palestinians citizenship intentionally, so they were kept in refugee camps with the intent of ensuring the fact that the problem will never go away. One of the articles that I did over the years, with now worth noting, she just passed away, Sylvia Kaddouri, who was Eli Kaddouri's widow, who ran the Middle East Studies Journal in London for many years. I published with my co-author Alex Shafi a piece about one of the more famous quotes in the Zionist narrative related to the Palestinians at large, and the quote basically goes that the Arabs of Palestine will, that they will always keep it as an open wound in order to maintain the problem generation to generation, in kind of loose terms here. The individual who gave that quote was actually a very famous general by the name of Alexander Galloway. Galloway unfortunately got lost in the historical narrative. His name got mixed up, and so there's a lot to be said about that. And of course, UNRWA has always denied that the individual worked for them because of the mix-up of the name, and that's part of what we did in the article, be able to kind of resurrect that history at large. But it is the most cited quote as it relates to the Arabs of Palestine. Galloway himself was the head of the Amman office of UNRWA in 1952. He testified in Congress about the political vehicle that UNRWA uses. Of course, after you make that kind of statement, you don't stay in office for very long, of course. So he did not, keep that job. But when he identified early on the early problems as it relates to UNRWA as trying to not resolve this problem at large. The Arab world, in order, while at the same time, as I said before, not willing to take in these individuals and give them citizenship as their Arab brethren, has paid what I would define basically as blood money to UNRWA to basically take care of them. And so the deal that was brokered is basically, we'll give you the money, because UNRWA has always been crying for more and more money. We have more and more people to take care of, and as long as you don't put the problem on us. And so that's how the reciprocity is played out. Now, as I said before, part of the mandate of UNRWA was to be a neutral, so to speak, organization to take care of the relief and the rehabilitation of Palestinian refugees. In that same vein, not to become a political organization. After the first 10 years of its existence, UNRWA has basically transformed itself into a political advocate for the Arab Palestinians. And this is, that's what the money that they were given in large sums by the Arab world has bought them. And basically the idea that we gave up the neutrality by transforming themselves into a political advocate and a political wing of the Palestinians. Another point to just to kind of articulate that very issue, which is also should not be minimized, is that UNRWA today represents the largest employer of Palestinians in the tone of 30,000. Just to put that in perspective, in contrast, the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which takes care of refugees worldwide, only has 5,000, not of the local communities that they deal with. And so, of course, here you have a case study where the client has hijacked a service provider. And so there's no surprise that, there has never been a desire by Palestinian society to remove UNRWA, because UNRWA is the largest employer of Palestinians, and they've used and abused, diplomatic immunity and things along those lines, in the contemporary research, and of course what you saw in Operation Protective Edge and in other operations where Israel had to go into Gaza and other places where you've had individuals who have worked by day for UNRWA, but members of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades by night. There has been no distinction, and they've been using UNRWA vehicles, UNRWA schools to transport munitions, caches of rockets. This was the biggest controversy in Protective Edge, as you might remember, when there were findings of large storage rooms of rocket caches of rockets in UNRWA schools, and of course UNRWA was like, we don't know how they got there. It was a surprise to us, but they've been working very closely with Hamas and other groups in that same vein, which is part of this ongoing reciprocity. So you have an environment where you have a UN agency, temporary, no less, selling to the Arab world. This is the number one issue. The Arab world has funded this agency in order to ensure the fact that the problem will never leave the international sin. To that end, that very critical point, 1948 is considered to be by the Palestinians and by the Arab world at large as the cardinal original sin. The original sin of Israel's coming to fruition as what is defined by the Arab-Palestinian narrative as the Nakba, the Holocaust, the catastrophe. And so the constant evergreen reminder that this problem comes to fruition as a result of the original sin are the Palestinian refugees. And that is the ongoing reminder to say, you created the problem, you don't want to solve it, and we're going to maintain and grow this problem. And so what you've seen in the 60s in particular, not only an expansion of the definition of Palestinian refugees, but a growth. And why is that? So according to Islamic lineage, of course, one's faith is determined by the father, very patriarchal system. They've also expanded the definition to the mother. And so this is where the numbers come from, where, everybody is a Palestinian refugee. I will also note the fact that based on the loose and expanded definition that you see when it comes to Arab Palestinian refugees, Arab Israelis are also considered to be Arab Palestinian refugees. So everybody's a Palestinian refugee according to UNRWA's accounts. So when you look at the numbers today, you're talking about, UNRWA talks about, between 5 to 6 million refugees worldwide. Where they all come from. This is the origin of the problem. And so that's one facet that needs to be understood. Now, the other part of the equation, which is obviously critical for us here in the West, while the Arab world has indeed given in-kind contributions to maintain the fact that they will deflect from responsibility, refugee camps will be maintained by UNRWA, we're not going to afford them citizenship, etc., etc. The West has also been a co-sponsor and an active funder of these initiatives. So currently the United States is represents number-wise about a third of UNRWA's annual budget, approximately $400 million a year that UNRWA gives that the United States gives to UNRWA. UNRWA goes to Congress every year. They have a lobbying office in Washington, and all they have to say was, of course, we take care of the betterment of Palestinian society. Please write us a check. Nobody should ever dare ask the question about the accountability and transparency and what are they doing with that money. One of the few people who started was back when he was a congressman, now former Senator Mark Kirk. Starting the UNRWA accountability bill out of Illinois, asking, Kirk used to work for the World Bank, and so Kirk asked for an audit and to say, show me, what did you buy with the money? Pencils, laptops, where's all this? UNRWA, of course, went, was livid by the idea that anybody would, question or, about what are they doing with the money? Why don't you just trust us? And so, of course, that also leads to a great deal of problems. I've been to the UNRWA archives. You can't figure out where the money is going and how many laptops they bought, whatnot. It's very complicated to even understand, how they're spending their money and how it actually works. That's another part of the problem. Again, how are they, as an international organization, not held to the same standards of other organizations when it comes to showing the money? And so that's another set of problems. Of late, of course, we're here in Canada. Canada 6 years ago decided to defund, I thought in a positive move from UNRWA, and as a result of an EU report that spoke about the incitement in UNRWA schools, ties to Hamas and other Islamist groups. Now they are re-upping their money, and so that's also. And so obviously, I actually just penned an op-ed in the National Post about a few weeks ago, questioning, what has actually changed. Did UNRWA actually change its tune? The same data that you had 6 years ago, did that change? No, nothing has changed. And so that's also part of the strength of UNRWA and the sympathy that goes into this mentality as a result of being the evergreen symbol of Palestinian oppression, Palestinian evergreen refuginess. This all feeds into Palestinian identity at large. Part of the reason we give money, the West at large, I would say, there is a cognitive dissonance that plays into the conversation that we feel as caretakers of the world, and when you say the word refugee, the impression is that individuals are living in places where there is no running water, there is no Wi-Fi, to say the least, and things are really bad. Sudan, that's not the case within the Palestinian refugees. They are actually suburbs of the Palestinian cities. If you actually go, which I've done over the years, interviewing individuals in the Palestinian refugee camps, what you do find a very common practice is that one would basically leave the refugee camps, hold on to a garage or a shack to show that they have a connection. In pragmatic terms, the Palestinians understand that they may not achieve a full right of return, but what they do know is it will translate into monetary compensation. Monetary compensation, one is to validate one's refuginess, so we have the ID cards, we have the keys, we have the symbolism, it all plays out. One of the biggest grassroots movements that comes out of Beirut, or in other places, even in North America at large, is what is known as the Haq al-Auda movement. Haq al-Auda refers to the right of return movement, connoting, of course, UN Resolution 194, which talks about the fact that there will be a full right of return. UNRWA, has been very clever, and very, about ensuring its mandate. So the original mandate of UNRWA, and to go back historically to kind of see how we got to today, the R within the acronym of UNRWA stands for resettlement, repatriation, as far as the actual conflict of these individuals. They have given up the R, the relief part of it, and the works, which in the W of UNRWA has now been basically transformed into education. The number one I would say, product that UNRWA actually does is education. So the entire UNRWA school systems is where you see a lot of this architecture taking place. Most Palestinians are alums of the UNRWA school system, to a point, if you fast forward a little bit even further, that the former Minister of Education within the PA was a former superintendent in the UNRWA schools. And so you have that reciprocity that plays out. So it is almost rare, anywhere at large to find any Palestinian who will criticize UNRWA and the problem, and what UNRWA does, even though UNRWA, I would say, has, to a large extent, been an obstacle for peace rather than any kind of a real mechanism for any kind of resolution. UNRWA on paper will say we will leave the environment or the situation at large once there is resolution for the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic. While at the same time, they are the gatekeeper of ensuring that the conflict will never end. And so this is part of the the contemporary debate that plays into the contemporary peace process. I mean, look, if you go back historically speaking, just of recent 23, 24 years ago into the Oslo era, the question of the right of return and the question of UNRWA has been put on what is defined as the final status negotiations. But there's been much more focus on the question of land issues. So the question of refugees has been put on the back burner. It is what has allowed Palestinian leaders, even individuals like Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, to go in 2011 to the United Nations and say, I want the Palestinian state tomorrow, but I'm not giving up the right of return, knowing exactly that that's a non-starter. And so Palestinians also understand that no Israeli government, left, right, or center, will ever accept a full right of return. It would alter the demographic majority of the state of Israel, and they're not going to take in 5 to 6 million individuals. Where there has been a debate, and an active debate, and what in the contemporary conversations, has been about the percentages, and and the state of Israel has agreed to take in, of course, the original 48, 49, and who are the individuals today as well. But going forward, there has to be an end to refugee status. And so that brings me to the latest legislation or the proposed legislation that was put in by Congress about the question of who is a refugee. We have demanded, we've looked to the individuals who were trying to draft out Kirk, Liana Ross-Leighton, Peter Roskim, and others. We're trying to figure out when can you end the refugee problem, because what you have now is you have an environment where every year the numbers continue to grow. It's the only population of refugees that continues to grow. The definition, of course, generation to generation, so you can inherit refugee status. So you have numbers growing from year to year. Based on those same numbers, then you ask for more and more money based on the population you're looking to serve. So the demand was, how do you end this? Let's change the definition. First of all, let's take out the element of descendants and the fact that going forward, you can demand any kind of help, humanitarian aid, but not based on refugee status, and that would start changing the individuals who are receiving refugee aid. And so, because again, just to put it into context, if you have 5 to 6 million individuals now, at the rate that we're going now, it'll be 15, 20 years down the road, it'll be 15, 20 million individuals, all demanding a right of return, and all saying to Congress and to other Western governments, we need money. And that's part and continuing to further and expand the problem from generation to generation. So there's been an attempt to make that happen. Let me also add another element to understand the complexity of UNRWA within the larger. I've been talking about the West. I've been talking about America, Canada, how we see the problems. Then there's, of course, the state of Israel. The government of Israel also needs to be looked at in the contemporary debate. The government of Israel position has been, it's kind of a catch-22 for the state of Israel, that if UNRWA doesn't provide these services, it's going to be Israel's problem. So, while Israel does not contribute monetarily to UNRWA, Israel is also, as a government, has not opposed UNRWA services. I have argued over the years it's not necessarily an Israeli problem because it's the West that's funding these problems. It's American, it's Canadian taxpayer dollars, and what are we actually getting for this agency that we're funding? I would also further argue that there are ways to what I argue, in the structure as far as what needs to happen is that basically Palestinian society needs to be weaned off UNRWA services, and there's a way to make that happen. What you're seeing today is basically that there is double dipping. There is overlap of services. The same individuals who are providing these services by UNRWA, who are all, the majority are Palestinians, these services should be the services of the Palestinian Authority. They're basically double dipping. So if the individuals who work for UNRWA are basically going to become civil servants of the Palestinian Authority, you could slowly wean UNRWA off of the problem. There could be a slow removal. I'm not saying cutting off services, without considering, how to move this over, but that's the process that needs to happen that UNRWA has refused to take place because they care about, like any bureaucracy, about their longevity. And, any bureaucracy never wants to go out of business. They've been in business for over 6 decades, and so there's no need to go out of business. So that's part of what needs to happen. For the first time in a very long time, former Israeli MK from the left, was former past MK, Einat Wilf, was able to propose a similar legislation in Israel about ending the right of return. Again, that terminology of ending relief, you can no longer be refugees for life. You have to start ending it, otherwise the problem will never go away. And so this is part of what you start to see for the first time in forever, really. You saw a tandem movement from the United States and from Israel to try to end this and try to end the problem. It was the first time that you saw that happen. I actually, Einat and I actually did, as a sidebar note, a panel about this, representing the American side and the Israeli side at the, I think it was 3 years ago at the AIPAC policy conference. It was the first time in a very long time that AIPAC even took on the issue of UNRWA. And that was also, I think, a shift in the right direction as far as addressing a real problem that's not going away. And so you have these movements finally to understand what UNRWA represents at large and the threat that plays into this the larger discourse. But ultimately, and I think that this is part of the pushback that one gets, and this is also something that needs to be understood, and I think is the biggest problem, in the conflict at large, is that Palestinian identity is synonymous to Palestinian refuginess. And so, if you tell a Palestinian you're no longer a refugee, then you give up the Palestinian identity element. And so to put that, into the context, if UNRWA is a safeguard of the same identity that we have created, we have made all over these years, so there's been, a sense that, we can never give that up. Again, there's a lot to be written and discussed about creating a independent Palestinian identity that is not rooted in refuginess, but that's also part of the reason where you have the animosity, the anti-Zionism, the anti-Semitism, all rooted as part of the refugee structure. And the education that plays into these individuals. And so that's another facet that needs to be looked at. However, all in all, UNRWA has basically taken over and hijacked this issue. Individuals who, UNRWA is a groupthink mentality, individuals who've ever dared to go against the norm, are of course shunned. Anybody who dares to air UNRWA's dirty laundry, I can count over the course of 7 decades, maybe 7 individuals who've done that, maybe 5, and they're no longer there. Going back to Alexander Galloway, there was a famous report, now famous, issued by James Lindsay, who was a former legal advisor for UNRWA in Gaza, who wrote a report for the Washington Institute of Near East Policy. James used to work for UNRWA. James is the only UNRWA employee that I know who I've sat on panels with who will go on record talking about the fact that, and taking into consideration the same criticism that I have described to you this evening, as far as UNRWA acting as a conduit for terrorism, the double dipping of numbers, resurrecting of the dead. There's a lot of games, that UNRWA has played over the years in order to maintain and to reach these vast numbers. But UNRWA is the evergreen. UNRWA represents, to my mind, at least the gatekeeper of the most evergreen problem and the guarantee that the conflict will never end. So long as there are refugees, the conflict will maintain itself and continue to maintain itself. And takes away from the centrality to my mind, and the argument about the fact that this is a territorial conflict. Obviously, everybody here in the room understands it's not solely a territorial issue, but the existence of Palestinian refugees represents at large why this problem will never go away. And everybody, and put it into contemporary terms, if you look at today at the contemporary boycott movement, the BDS movement in North America at large, they to a large extent have adopted, a demand for a right of return, and symbolisms of Palestinian refugees as the evergreen symbol of Palestinian oppression. It all feeds into the propaganda that we have been fed in a slow but steady diet in the West about the reality that is taking place in the Middle East at large, and what is actually, between fact and fiction. These are the real issues. I will say also something, just to take you back historically speaking, another point, and then before we, open up to questions, and I've thrown out a lot of information here. I don't want to overwhelm everybody by all the minutia of all of this, but before UNRWA's coming to fruition, and this was actually the topic of my book. The group responsible for UNRWA, for the Arab Palestinians in Gaza, was the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. It's a story that nobody knows about. I never heard about the Quakers, let alone understand how they got to the Middle East. But the Quakers had responsibility for Gaza for about 16 months. Between 1948 and 1950, and they got their mandate from Eleanor Roosevelt. Quakers are pacifists. They were involved in the DP camps in Europe, and in 1947 they win a Nobel Peace Prize. They were at the height of their popularity. And so when Eleanor Roosevelt offers them the opportunity to solve peace between Arabs and Jews, of course they could not say no to that. So the Quakers go to Gaza, and Quakerism is not an organized religion. It's more about doing. Many of the field workers in Gaza is how they articulated and voiced their Quakerism, or at large. And what was fascinating about the Quaker experience, and this is the largest refugee and the largest relief operation they've ever taken on, and nothing since, is that they identified the real problems. So many of the problems that we talk about today in contemporary UNRWA, who is a refugee, the double numbers, the resurrecting of the dead, and what was also fascinating about it is that they come at a point in time when American foreign policy under Dean Acheson and others were meeting at Lake Success, and all these meetings that were taking place as far as between churches and other voluntary groups. American foreign policy was rooted in three issues: reintegration, repatriation, and resettlement. Were the core issues of how dealt with refugee populations. You will go back to the Tennessee Valley and operation. It was all rooted in the idea that this is what needs to happen in order to resolve problems. And so that was the mandate of the Quakers. The fascinating part about this population is that within the case study of Palestine, we went against American foreign policy at large, because what was fascinating is that one of the main reasons that the Quakers left the arena of Gaza in the transition into UNRWA was because they identified the United Nations and UNRWA in particular as a red tape bureaucracy that was not going to achieve that kind of resolution of resettlement, reintegration, and repatriation. And they leave the scene. And that is a beginning of, which is, what I write about in the book, is basically the lessons not learned from the transition between the Quakers and UNRWA. In fact, the Quakers and some of the field workers were asked to stay on by UNRWA because they had the skill set, they had the expertise, they had the knowledge, but they refused to because of how they started to see the United Nations, and by then they were quite fed up with dealing with both the Egyptians and other groups, and so they decided that it was time to leave the scene. UNRWA takes over the United Nations at large, and this is the beginning of this story. So we had all that information. Unfortunately, the Quakers have forgotten about the lessons learned in Gaza, and the Quakers today, the American Friends Service Committee, is actually the leading groups with the Jewish Voice for Peace in supporting Boycott. They're the same groups who are actually sponsoring the BDS summer camps, together with the JVP, and that shift took place in the 1960s, where basically they started to see Israel as a nuclear power, and to start to see Israel as the Goliath, Palestinians as the David. There's a whole replacement theology that takes place in Quakerism at large. But it was a fascinating project to view about the lesson that the Quakers learned in Gaza. All of this is part of the story that needs to be looked at large, but there is a wealth of knowledge of history of how we got to where we are today. I think that if we are concerned, and if Western countries and if the world and Israel at large is concerned about trying to resolve or see some kind of resolution for the conflict, then this should be the number one issue. And until we're willing to tackle this problem head on, we're going to see this growing, metastasizing, and from generation to generation. The totality of Palestinian identity is rooted in this pure absolutism of refugee. So the symbolism is there. There's no need to define anything. You can tell any Palestinian refugee, Chak al-Auda and Palestinian refugees, everybody knows what that means. There's no need to define it. And so that is probably the success story of Palestinian identity, all sponsored by, that is funded, in the tone of millions by the West. And this is a problem that we need to be looking at very carefully. Again, money is tight, and then the question is how much do we want to sponsor as far as the continuation and actually growing a problem rather than actually resolving a problem. And so, on that note, let me end and let me open up the floor to as many questions. Thank you.